everyone. Welcome to the lecture series on Indian philosophy. Today, I will introduce you to Sankhya epistemology. Sankhya system, like other schools of Indian philosophy, has a well-formed epistemology or theory of knowledge. If we compare the Sankhya system with other systems of Indian philosophy, we find that out of the 6 pramanas or means by which knowledge is obtained, and which include pratyaksha, anuman, upaman, shabda, arthapatti and anuplabdhi, Kapila, the founder of the Sankhya system, accepts only 3. I will tell you what these 3 pramanas are and why he limits all possible knowledge only to these 3 means. But before that, let us understand what exactly these 6 pramanas are. Now, pratyaksha or perception, we all know, is experience based on our sense organs. When the sense organs act on their proper objects, pratyaksha is the result. Anuman or inference is knowledge which we arrive at through the invariable relationship between 2 things. The example that is generally given to explain anuman is wherever there is smoke, there is fire. This hill has fire because it has smoke. So, it is a process of reasoning where a conclusion is drawn. Now, upamana or comparison gives knowledge based on analogy. For example, this wild animal looks like the cow in the city. Then comes shabda or verbal testimony, which is generally identified with the authority of the Vedas as the infallible source of knowledge. But you know, different schools have different views regarding these sources of knowledge. Schools which do not believe in the authority of the Vedas regard their own texts as authoritative. Anyway, let us now come to the 5th pramana, which is arthapatti or postulation. Now consider this example and see how knowledge is arrived at through postulation. Devadatta does not eat by day and yet is fat. Now these facts allow us to postulate that Devadatta eats by night. Interesting, isn't it? Now, the 6th and the last pramana is anuplabdhi or non-cognition. It is through this pramana that we apprehend non-existences, like there are no flowers in the sky. So, as I said a while ago, that the Sankhya system out of these 6 pramanas accepts only 3, and they are pratyaksha, anumana and shabda. To corroborate this, we can have a look at the 4th verse of the Sankhya Karika. And it is Drishtam anumanam aptavachanam cha sarva pramana siddhatvat trividham pramanam ishtam pramaya siddhihi pramanat hi, which may be translated as perception, inference and valid testimony are the means. By these, all other means of right cognition too are established, as they are included in the above 3. Proof is intended to be of 3 kinds. It is through the proofs that the provables are established. So, you get the answers to both the questions. Question 1 was, what are the pramanas accepted by the Sankhya system? To which their answer is pratyaksha, anuman and shabda. Question 2 was, why they recognize only 3 pramanas out of the 6 pramanas generally considered in Indian epistemology. To this, their answer is that the other pramanas, namely Upamana, Arthapatti and Anuplabdhi are very much included within the three pramanas accepted by them, and therefore there is no need to recognize them as separate pramanas. At this point, we can have a look at two more verses of the Sankhya Karika. Verse 5 of the Sankhya Karika says, Prati Vishaya Adhyavasayah Drishtam Trividham Anumanam Akhyatam Tat Linga Lingi Purvakam Apta Shrutihi Apta Vachanam Tu. Which means perception is the ascertainment of each respective object by the senses. Inference is declared to be of three kinds, and it is preceded by a knowledge of the middle term, linga, and major term, lingi, while valid testimony is the statement of trustworthy persons and the Veda. Verse 6 of the Sankhya Karika is also significant as it talks about acquiring knowledge of supersensible things. It says, Samanyatah tu drishtat atindriyanam pratitihi anumanat tasmat apicha asiddham paroksham apta agamat siddham. Which may be translated as, but the knowledge of supersensible things is obtained through inference based on general observation, and the knowledge of supersensible things not established even by that is established through testimony and revelation. So what I explained before should be clear now as to why the Sankhya wish to stick only to the three pramanas. Anyway, before we begin understanding these three pramanas, it is worthwhile to understand a few important terms. They are pramata, which means the subject, prameya, which is the object, and pramana, which I guess you already are familiar with, is the instrument or means of knowledge. In all valid cognitions, these three factors will remain present. Now, pramata is the conscious principle. It is the same as the self, the pure consciousness, the Purusha. It is the self that receives and recognizes knowledge. Prameya, as I said, is the object that appears before the self. And what is the significance of pramana, which is the third important factor? Now, pramana is the modification of the antahkarana through which the pramata knows the prameya, and which is why it is so appropriately translated as an instrument or means of knowledge. So, valid knowledge of the Sankhya system is the reflection of the Purusha in the antahkarana, which is modified into the form of the object. Now, it is time to understand the Sankhya view of Pratyaksha. You will notice that they give a very realistic account of perception, as they say that first there is contact between the sense organ and the object, and then between the sense organ and the antahkarana, comprising of the buddhi, the ahankar and the manas. Then there is this contact between the antahkarana and the Purusha, which ultimately leads to the knowledge of the object. So, true knowledge of an external object is attained when the impression of the object is perceived through the senses and recorded in the intellect, which then reflects the light of consciousness onto those objects. So you see, in this system, knowledge, rather valid knowledge, is a definite and error-free cognition that is illuminated by the self through its reflection in the buddhi. I told you in my previous lecture that whether it is buddhi or ahamkara or manas, they're all unconscious. They are material, and due to this reason they cannot perceive objects. So consciousness is required for perception, and we know that consciousness is none other than the self or purusha. It is also important to know that consciousness or purusha cannot by itself apprehend the objects. Do you remember why? I've already discussed this in detail in my previous lectures. Anyway, it is because purusha is inactive. It does not perform actions. It is motionless, and action or motion are necessary for apprehending the objects of the world. Also, if purusha could directly apprehend the objects, then we could know every object in the world, for the simple reason that purusha is infinite and omnipresent. But that does not happen. So purusha or the self apprehends the objects through the antakarana as well as the senses. Actually, there are some differences between the two great commentators on the Sankhya literature regarding the interpretation of the Sankhya theory of perception. More specifically about the theory of reflectionism. These two philosophers are Vijnana Bhikshu and Vachaspati Mishra. Interestingly, they both are Advaitins. Anyway, they knew the system more than us, so we need to understand their interpretations carefully and choose whichever we find the most convincing. Vijnana Bhikshu claims that perception of an object takes place when there is a shared or corresponding reflection of the purusha in the buddhi and of the buddhi in the purusha. Let's understand what this means. Now, when the senses come in contact with the object and transmit the impression of it to the manas or the mind, the manas then transmits the impression to the buddhi. The buddhi on its part assumes the form of the object because being a product of Prakriti, it is unconscious and therefore cannot examine the experience of the object on its own. Now, because of the supremacy of the sattva guna in the buddhi is reflected in the purusha, and the purusha is also reflected in the buddhi, which has already assumed the form of the object. This is how the buddhi perceives the object. Let us take an example. When the eye comes in contact with a jar, the impression of the jar is formed in the eye. This impression is now supplied to the mind. The mind acts on it and transmits it to the intellect. The intellect now transforms itself and assumes the form of the jar. The preponderance of sattva guna in the intellect facilitates the intellect to reflect its assumed form in the self, which is immediately reflected back to the intellect. So, you see, the material and unconscious buddhi assuming the form of the jar becomes lighted up into a conscious state so that the perception of the jar becomes possible. To give an analogy, we can say, just as a mirror reflects the light of a lamp and therefore illuminates other objects, so the intellect, an unconscious principle, reflects the consciousness of the self and recognizes objects. Okay, now let us discuss the interpretation of Vachaspati Mishra. How he understands sage Kapila's view of perception. According to Vachaspati Mishra, this reflectionism is not a two-way process. Indeed, there is reflection of purusha in the buddhi, but there is no reciprocal reflection of the buddhi into the purusha. Of course, the object comes in contact with the eyes or any other sense organ, where its impression is made, which then goes to the mind or manas. From there, it is transmitted to the buddhi, and the buddhi transforms itself into the form of that object. It is here the ever-shining Purusha lights up the sattvic buddhi, which then reflects that light of Purusha onto the object. This experience or perception of the object by the buddhi gives the impression as if buddhi is conscious, but it is not. So we can say the intellect is just like a mirror that reflects the light of a lamp and itself becomes capable of illuminating other objects as well. Now, these two interpretations lead to two remarkably interesting theories. According to the view of Vijnana Bhikshu, the internal perceptions like pleasure, pain, or indifference, these are experienced by the Purusha himself, because for Vijnana Bhikshu, there is a two-way reflection of the Purusha in the buddhi and of the buddhi in the Purusha. They reflect each other. However, if we consider the interpretation of Vachaspati Mishra, then pleasure, pain, or indifference, they are experienced only by the buddhi and not by the Purusha. Because for Vachaspati Mishra, perception is only a one-way process. One thing we must acknowledge that the views of both Vachaspati Mishra and Vijnana Bhikshu are correct insofar as all that reaches the buddhi is experienced by the Purusha. A kind of identity exists between the Purusha and the buddhi. And if this oneness between the two is relaxed a bit, then the consciousness emanating from the Purusha enables the buddhi to appear as if it were conscious, and the buddhi experiences the object. And if this oneness between the two is relaxed even further, as the buddhi experiences, so the Purusha beholds the buddhi as a witness. According to the Sankhya system, pratyaksha is of two kinds: indeterminate and determinate. Indeterminate is one which pertains to merely seeing the object. It arises at the time of the contact between the sense organ and the object, and is therefore prior to any kind of analysis or synthesis of the received sensory data. Determinate perception, on the other hand, is one which is the outcome of the analysis and synthesis of the sensory data and the interpretation of it. Indeterminate perception is alochana, whereas determinate perception is vivechana. Okay, now coming back to the Sankhya Karika. You remember in the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned the fifth Karika in order to state the three pramanas accepted by the Sankhya school. I wish to now state it again and extract the pratyaksha portion from it so that we clearly understand what it means. The Karika goes like this. Prati Vishaya Adhyavasayah Drishtam Trividham Anumanam Akhyatam Tat Linga Lingi Purvakam Apta Shrutihi Apta Vachanam Tu. I will focus only on the first portion of it, which is Prati Vishaya Adhyavasayah Drishtam. This actually is the definition of perception, which means perception is the application of the sense organs to their appropriate objects. Keep in mind that there is a specific object for each sense. Now, this application of the sense organ is actually the contact that takes place between the sense organ and the object. Interwoven in this is the whole process involving antakarana, which includes manas, ahamkar and buddhi. But an interesting thing comes out of it, and that is perception excludes memory, and even inference, as there is no contact taking place between the sense and the object in either of the two. Another term I wish to discuss is adhyavasaya. Now this word is important because it excludes samshaya or doubtful cognition from perception. Of course, when there is doubt, we cannot know anything with certainty, and therefore knowledge must be doubt-free. So, adhyavasaya is included in the definition of perception to emphasize that perception is a definite or exact cognition. In the end, I would like to mention an interesting karika which in fact beautifully explains the extent of perception. It is ati durat samipyat indriya ghatat manas anavasthanat sakshmayat vyavadhanat abhibhavat samana abhiharat cha, which may be translated as apprehension of even existing things does not arise through excessive distance, proximity, impairment of senses, absent-mindedness, subtlety, intervention, suppression by other objects, intermixture with other similar objects and other causes. Now understand this. The karika states some reasons which hinder definite perception to take place. When an object is very far, then we cannot decipher what exactly it is. Likewise, when an object is extremely close to you, we cannot know what it is. Can you see the whole elephant when it is this close to you? Also, when our eyes, for example, are not functioning properly, we cannot know the object properly. And when we are absent-minded, we do not notice the object right in front of us. Further, when the object is subtle, like the basic elements, we cannot see them. Then if there is an obstruction in the middle of the eye and the object, then also the eye cannot see the object. Also, due to the suppression by other objects, perception gets affected. For example, you and your friend, you're talking while sitting in a room, and all of a sudden in the same room somebody starts playing extremely loud music and you don't hear anything that your friend says. So, no definite audible perception takes place. And lastly, when there is an intermixture with other similar objects, there is difficulty in perceiving the object. For example, there are lots of nails scattered on the ground and you have to pick up the one which is not made of iron but made of steel. So, again, it becomes very difficult. Anyway, with this, I will end my lecture. Thank you so much for listening.